I am very excited. What I think is really interesting about what you shared, Reverend Lien, is there are a crew of us from EBMC that I think were born in some version. Our awakening to the Dharma was deepened. Our connections were strong. Our Kalyanamita, our community has really created an impact. And now I watch you and the amazing things that you're doing, right? And I think about the teaching that I'm doing, and I feel like we're contributing. We're meeting our intention for contributing to the more accessible Dharma, in this country and in the world. So I'm so honored to be here. I love to see some familiar faces, and I wanted to start with just a quick introduction of who I am and why I'm here. I've been a fan of Reverend Lien's for a long time, and I really am committed to sharing the Dharma. I am from Chicago, on the south side of. I grew up and was in the nonprofit industrial complex there. My mother was my first Dharma teacher. She really she taught me how to sit and how to practice. She was a meditator all her life, and so I had the skeleton, the framework early, but I didn't think much of it or use it much. So I was working in nonprofits. I took this job that was really important. Like, it really helped me to feel like I was contributing to community. It was job training for formerly incarcerated folks, but it was exhausting, and it did what the industrial nonprofit complex does. It just drained me. It was so much. It was such powerful, wonderful work, and also I was really losing track of myself. Everything became this kind of external focus. I did not have much of a internal reflective practice, and I really burned myself into a very dark and tragic place. And I was really sick and was very desperate. And at the time, I was invited to be a fellow here in Oakland, and so I came on this fellowship opportunity, and I just realized I've got to get out of Chicago and break some habits. So I moved to California, and I was like, what do Californians do? Oh, they go on these silent retreat things. That's what I'm going to do. I know how to meditate. I'm going to go to Spirit Rock for the POC sit. And I was silent for 9 days. And for those of us who've been on retreat, it's like, those first few days are okay, but those middle sections and those towards the end of the week, I was just really suffering that I had not been aware of, that I had stuffed inside so long ago and so deep, started to arise. And I just, I broke my silence and went to the retreat manager. I'm like, I don't know. It's too painful. It hurts too much. I don't know what to do. And I just couldn't stop crying. And I was like, you better get somebody. I feel like I'm going to really lose control here. And so they called Jita Sharp and Larry Yang, who were both teachers on the retreat. And they came. They're both like this big. And I'm a big guy. And they came to try and get me together. And they just held me while I touched into very deep suffering. And they offered me these tools. They offered me a tool of blue sky and expansive thinking. They offered me this shifting your attention practice. And it's it just made all the difference in the world. That was 12 years ago. And ever since then, I've been on this journey to, wow, why doesn't everybody know these tools? And I was lucky enough to find them here at Spirit Rock, but I want them to be more accessible. So for the last 12 years, I've been on this journey to make the Dharma more accessible and the cessation of suffering, right? Not that it just happens in Marin on a mountain up high up in a hill, but that it can happen in downtown Oakland, or it can happen on the south side of Chicago, or it can happen, for populations that have historically been marginalized and left out of the consideration and don't have the same access. So that's what I'm about. That's why I'm here. And I'm hoping to offer you something tonight in my talk about why speech that may resonate or at least spark something. So that's my intention. So my question to the group is, why do you practice? What is the impetus for your study? Why do you come here? Why do you meditate? You don't need to answer, but I will invite you to consider the question, because if your answer isn't only to wake up in this lifetime, then I think it's a great provocative kind of practice to be like, well, why are we practicing? If it isn't to awaken, maybe it is to awaken this lifetime, but if it's not, then what do we follow these teachings for? What I'm pointing towards is that the path that has been laid out, the Eightfold Path that has been laid out in this practice, is a great condition. They're great guidelines. They're great pointers. They point us towards practices that can improve the quality of our lives. So we don't just practice to awaken, but we practice to improve the quality of our life and to reduce the suffering. And there are so many ways that we do this, the four foundations of mindfulness, of the body, of emotions. I mean, we have many practices. And tonight I really want to focus in on the Eightfold Path and specifically wise speech, right? These wholesome endeavors that we create, these practices that we can put our attention and our effort towards that can really reduce our suffering in this world. And to reduce the suffering is to create more space for joy and more space for a life that we can, that's even stronger. Like when I fell apart, I needed practices. I needed community that would point me towards this. And so the Eightfold Path is quite instructional and quite a great resource to build on. The other thing I want to point towards before I talk specifically about wise speech is the community that's here. The way that we practice alone has a counterpoint when we practice in community. Right, the value of our internal practice, right? So that we build our concentration and our focus. We build, for me, a lot of times it's the ability to slow down and make choices to respond instead of being reactionary. Early in my practice, I was very much like, oh, I'm hurt, then I'm going to hurt you, or this is suffering and now I'm sad, and I have now more tools to consider. When something hurts me, I can consider like, oh, is this right? How do I want to choose to respond instead of just reacting? And so I think for all these reasons, it's really wonderful to have a community, right? So then if all of us are doing this together, if Reverend Liēn and I are both on this journey and committed to reducing suffering for ourselves and others, that healing, that impact kind of like goes out, ripples out. And so I just again point towards the wonderful work of this group, right? And any of our Kalyanamita or like friends on the path journey, spiritual journey together, any work that we do towards that is actually really important for ourselves and for our community. So all right, so to speak about the wise speech, the components of wise speech are kind of broken up into several sections. When considering our practice of what we're sharing and what we say to each other, the first component we want to look at is your speech honest and truthful? Combing through your experiences today, maybe a conversation that you've had with a friend or a colleague. You may consider an email that you would have sent or even a social media post. And if we have this mindful practice of combing through those and looking for the truth, there's so many ways in social media that we are shaping and flavoring kind of what we're sharing so that we get an explicit outcome. I might share with you how pleasant my meal over lunch was, but I didn't share with you that my partner and I had like a difficult fight. And why is that? Right? Is it truthful to tell our story if it's just in parts that generate a specific response we're looking for? I think wise speech would invite us to consider, to be honest and truthful about all of it. And we're not trying to create desired outcomes with our speech, but that we are speaking truthful and in honest ways. The second consideration is your speech timely? When you consider what you're sharing and how you communicate, what are the unforeseen consequences that may be at play? Have you taken time to consider, if I share this now, will it be as valuable as if I were to share it later? We have these experiences often in partnership and in relationship where, in a heated argument, what you share and how you share matters. Is this the right time to point out, to your colleague that they've made an error, right? I think of the practice, I've done a lot of theater in my life, and there was this rule that we had in community theater that was like, on the first night of the performance, we only receive like positive affirming feedback, right? Because the timing of it was such that we had put in all this work, and to hear difficult feedback the first night was always really hard. That feedback may still be valuable the next day or the day after. So considering the timeliness of your feedback. The third component of wise speech to look at is around your intention. What is the practice that you undergo to consider, not just the benefit to you sharing, but what the impact will be? What is your intention? If you were to sit with the content you're considering sharing and really notice, what is the foreseen outcome of this? Like, am I sharing this for the benefit of somebody else? Is it for the benefit of myself? And that's okay. But to be clear, the wise speech requires that you have good intention. I can speak from my own personal experience that there are ways in which I have shared information, with good intention. But if I'm honest and I were really to settle and sit quietly, that I have been agitating. I have been looking to agitate. And sometimes it can be very subtle. Noticing in a well-intentioned comment, sitting with it for a while and just paying attention and noticing about the relationship and the moment. There are places where I think that my intention may not be all the way pure. And the practice of really being mindful and being slow and quiet can help us, detect something like this. So can you really be sure that you have scanned through all of the content that you wish to share and are noticing, if you have a pure intent to offer? Can you be mindful of your phrases and not just like what you're saying, but how you say it? A well-intentioned comment has a particular energy to it. And can you notice that when you share? Right? The kind of like terse, tight-lipped, like, oh, it's fine, that was nice, versus like an open-hearted and kind of hearty, like, I really enjoyed that. It transmits differently. And if you sit with your comment and your content, you may notice that it isn't coming from a open-hearted place, and you may choose whether it's the right time to share that comment. Okay, one more component, is your speech useful? And I think along with that question of utility is also, is it for whom is it useful? Is it useful for you? Is it useful for them? Right. So you want to consider the utility. So I can think of certain places where the speech that I share is benefiting someone else. Oh, if I give them this information, then they will be better off in the future. That will be useful for them. Or if I give them information that about my perception of their work, did they ask for it? Right? Is it really useful for them? So there's lots of ways to like kind of break this apart and look at it, but I'll invite you to think about the utility of speech and understand. Once you understand the intention and the utility, it can really help us to notice and gauge what we're sharing and how. So I'm going to pause and kind of like walk us back again and just say, looking at the components of wise speech that include, is your speech honest and truthful? Is it timely? Is this the right time to share? Does it need to be shared? Do you have pure and good intention with your sharing and being mindful of the impact, even with good intention? And is your speech useful? So, with those qualifiers or with those components, you could actually build an entire lifetime's worth of practice around this, right? So I'll invite you to think for a few minutes, just, where could you practice these, checking for these components? One thing that I've done, I was in a program at East Bay Meditation Center called Commit to Dharma. And our monthly meetings were to discuss the teachings and develop practices. And we would practice for a month with each component. So for wise speech, for an entire month, would look at the way that we were communicating. We were assigned to go through our emails, to look at our Facebook posts, to like make notes about the conversations we had during the day, and just to notice for our own awareness of where we were not all the way honest, or maybe our intention wasn't 100% pure, or to like learn about, what was useful in our speech and what was not. Something I love as a teacher is really inviting the practice. So starting with this idea that there's a purpose for practice that is even in addition to or beyond awakening in this lifetime. We can reduce our suffering and the suffering of others through following some of these invitations, such as wise speech. So I think later on we will break into dyads, and I'm going to ask you to consider what's one thing that you might do to deepen your practice around wise speech. If you're using these components to kind of measure for that, you may share with your partner one place that you can practice. A place to point to that doesn't always land or doesn't always arise when you think about wise speech is the deep listening as a form of wise speech, right? That the capacity for us to hear and listen for understanding instead of to respond is another place to put our attention and our mindfulness around wise speech. So I think about the places where even as we were checking in and saying our names and what land we're on, how are you holding that's sharing? How are you holding those names in those places? Because wise speech has a lot to do with being able to deeply listen. It increases our capacity to with kindness when we're listening and can understand the conditions of others. And so the practices of deep listening are beneficial both for ourselves and for the people that we're speaking with. I'll pause there. Let's see. How am I on time? I have until I'm good on time, right?
Oh, yeah, you are.
Great. I was so excited to hear that you all are using the Heart of the Buddha's teachings. You can see how much I love this book because this is what I teach from. I know, it's great, right? So I wanted to point right to that section on right speech. Thich Nhat Hanh, is such a heavy influence in my life. I mentioned my mother was my first teacher of the Dharma, and she, had practiced at Plum Village, and she was, had a lot of the books, and so his passing was, for a lot of us, very difficult. My attachment to his teachings, not just his teaching, but his teaching style, like his writing style. But his books are very direct for me. A lot of times I'll read books on the Dharma, and I feel like there's a lot of extra around it. And I feel like Thich Nhat Hanh's writings transmit to me. And it was true for my mother as well. And so I hold him with special reverence in my heart. And I don't know if you could find someone practicing who hasn't been touched by Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings, or somebody who's been impacted by somebody else who's been touched by his teachings. And so I was ecstatic when Reverend Liēn told me you were reading this book. So I just want to point to a few things.
And would you say the pages? Because people do have the books.
And we have great.
An online version too.
I think it's the same, even though this is my mom's book, so it's kind of older. So I'm on page 84. I think that's where right speech starts, chapter 12. At the bottom of the page, the classical explanation, just going to run through because I gave my description of the components, but I'll just read through it quickly. The classical explanation of right speech is 1, speaking truthfully with something that's green, we say it is green and not purple. So that's speaking the truth. Oh, thank you, Barbara. Number 2, this is on page 85, not speaking with a forked tongue. We describe the truth in different ways to help different listeners understand our meaning, but we must always be loyal to the truth. This is the thing I was pointing to around flavoring, or kind of like sharing what you want to get the reaction. We stay away from this. Not speaking cruelly is number 3. Number 4 is not exaggerating or embellishing. And just noticing that these, this teaching is very, very old, right? And yet it is so relevant today. When I think about the ways in which social media talks about exaggerating or embellishing, when I think about politicians that I'm listening to every day, like in our culture, we can be very easily swept up into this exaggerating and embellishing. It's almost become the water we're swimming in. It's ubiquitous. And so if we are not pausing to practice and notice, if we're not pausing to notice and then practice wise speech, it's very easy to get swept up in this. Another thing that arises is the way that we speak to ourselves. And if right speech is not only for those that you're communicating with externally, but how do we hold things in our own minds? Right speech is based on right thinking. That's what Thich Nhat Hanh has said here. And if I think about the ways in which we are alone in our heads, that we will question everything that we hear is our nature, except when it comes from ourselves. And so if we are not aware of our minds and we're not aware of the way we're speaking to ourselves, that can have very heavy impact. So, what might a practice involve that included being checking those components for speech with ourselves? I can imagine both the subtle and not pleasant ways that I might judge myself and comment to myself. I have this habit of, I will say out loud to myself. My husband can always tell when I'm frustrated with myself because I do this. I go, "Oh, crap on a cracker. Oh, crap on a cracker." It's just a phrase I picked up. And it's just like, it only shows up when I'm like beating myself up in my head. And so my husband will say like, "What did you do? What's going on?" But now I've taken to this practice of I notice it, and then I really try to like speak to myself more kindly, because what comes with that is very nasty internally. And so when I think about the practices that we have for noticing how we speak to ourselves, like, what do you say to yourself? Where are the places? Is it in the shower? Is it, before you go to bed? Like, where are the places that your thinking is equivalent to speaking to yourself? And if you were to consider all these components, am I speaking to myself truthfully? Am I speaking to myself? Is this the right time to think this or to say this to myself? Do I have the intention of like being kind to myself, which is so important? Is this useful thinking / speaking to myself? So I would turn the practice again internal and see how we might benefit from turning that practice internally. And I'm just going to read a component from page 86 towards the bottom. Deep listening is the foundation of right speech. Oh wait, that's not what I wanted to read, sorry. It's the deep thinking. Sorry, a minute. Okay, well, I underlined it, so I'm going to read it. Deep listening is the foundation of right speech. If we cannot listen mindfully, we cannot practice right speech. No matter what we say, it will not be mindful, because we will be speaking only our own ideas and not in response to the other person. In the Lotus Sutra, we are advised to look and listen with the eyes of compassion. Compassionate listening brings about healing. When someone listens to us this way, we feel some relief right away. A good therapist always practices deep, compassionate listening. We have to learn to do the same in order to heal the people we love and restore communication with them. It's very direct. If we are not listening, then we aren't as able to tap into the compassion that's required in order to be in right relationship with people. And so I just invite you to consider how you might align your thoughts and your practices around wise speech to include listening and to include, an internal component of how you speak to yourself. Yeah. So on page 90, in the middle of the page, this is written in a different time, so no Facebook back then, but I think it translates. Thich Nhat Hanh says, letter writing is a form of speech. A letter can sometimes be safer than speaking because there's time for you to read what you have written before sending it. As you read your words, you can visualize the other person receiving your letter and decide if what you have written is skillful and appropriate. Your letter has to water the seeds of transformation in the other person and stir something in his heart if it is to be called right speech. Right. So this is a theme that shows up in many places around watering the seeds, having the intention to water the seeds that you want to grow, turning your mind towards wholesomeness and watering these seeds with these practices so that you will be growing the desired experiences. And so if I were to replace letter writing with Facebook posts, I wonder how many of us might have to consider if we were reading our words and visualizing the other person receiving our post, to decide that if what we've written is skillful and appropriate. I want to just identify with the experience of, I try to stay out of the comments. I try. It's good advice to stick with the post and leave the comments alone, because in the comments is where the phrase begin. So I can think of a time very recently. My cousin lives in Florida and she has a different political perspective than I do. And she posted something that was blatantly incorrect. And it was misinformation that she's my cousin. I've known her since birth. And I'm like, nuh-uh, like not on my watch on Facebook. So I got on my soapbox and I wrote, I thought it was pretty skillful is what I thought at the time. I wrote, her post was about an ill-fitted, inappropriate description of what socialism is. And so I just wrote, this is not socialism. And what happened next was a flood of her people on Facebook came for me and like, well, yes, it is. And why isn't it? And this and that and the third. And it's not that I have a political science degree and spent a lot of time talking about socialism and communism and studying it. It was just, what's the effort and energy that I'm putting now into this experience? Certainly was not, to the benefit of my cousin. It caused quite a stir, quite a ruckus. My intention was to shut down something that I thought was really could cause a lot of harm. And yet my action caused a lot of activity and harm. So I don't come to this from a pedestal at all. I come to this from a very genuine and affected place of like, how much are we practicing right speech? I literally had written part of this talk before that happened. And so, how will you notice in your life where your posts are? Like, can you think about who's going to be reading it or the impact it might have? And you may choose, I may have chosen to do it anyway, but the choice, right? The response and not react is important. And so I invite you to be and do better than I have, and to bring the quality of integrity and turn the heat up on your practice just a little bit and see if you can notice where you are impacting, where you are being mindful of your speech. And because you're in this beautiful community together, I'm sure that you can find ways to practice and share with each other, like what it would be to turn up the heat on your practice just a little bit.